The second scripture reading today comes from Matthew 26, verses 6 to 13. You follow along in your pew Bible if you would like. This is when Jesus, he's right before he's about to be arrested and taken to trial. Now, while Jesus was at Bethany in the house of Simon the leper, a woman came to him with an alabaster jar of very costly ointment, and she poured it on his head as he sat at the table. But when the disciples saw it, they were angry and said, "Why this waste? For this ointment could have been sold for a large sum and the money given to the poor." But Jesus, aware of this, said to them, "Why do you trouble this woman? She has performed a good service for me. For you always have the poor with you, but you will not always have me. By pouring this ointment on my body, she has prepared me for burial. Truly I tell you, wherever this good news is proclaimed in the whole world, what she has done will be told in remembrance of her." This is the word of the Lord. How's everybody feeling today? We're doing okay? Are we feeling a little lethargic? How are we feeling? I don't know. First service, it was kind of, just a little bit, And so, anyways, I just see a lot of tired eyes. I mean, this is the time when you're supposed to be, really with it, right? Really together. Are you all out staying late at night, clicking on the internet, trying to find all of your presents that you forgot to order and everything, getting it done? Come on, this is Christmas time. This is supposed to be fun. All right, were you with me? All right, let's do this thing. So today, I actually want to start by talking about ants. Not your mother's sister, which is pronounced aunt. I'm talking about teeny, tiny little ants. So, have you ever taken the time to look at ants, to observe them? Maybe when you were a kid and you had a little magnifying glass and you're trying to burn them. Is that why? Is that the only time? Huh? No? Well, if you've ever taken time to look at these things, they are absolutely amazing little creatures because they're a paradox. On the one hand, they are some of the dumbest creatures on the planet. And on the other hand, they are some of the most brilliant. Have you ever watched an ant work its way into a space where it can't find its way out? It's so stupid, it can't remember how it got into this space. And so it's probably going to starve to death because it's going to traverse back and forth trying to figure out an exit strategy. Because if there's no other ants around, it's done. And so as individuals, ants are pretty mindless creatures. They act primarily on instinct, and that instinct, it's not very fine-tuned. But then you take that same ant, you place it inside of a colony with a lot of other ants, and this thing that could barely find its way back from where it came, it starts doing things that seem well beyond its mental capacity. Did you know that ants are able to farm? They can actually keep livestock like humans can and maintain them. Now, I know that might be hard to believe, but it's actually true. So let me give you an example. Ants love to eat this nectar called honeydew. It's not from a honeydew melon, it's from a stalk. But the thing is, they have trouble getting access to it. So what they've evolved the ability to do is they take this bug known as an aphid, and they literally capture it on the stalk. They will build fences around this thing and shelters so that it can't get away. It's kind of like how humans build fences for cows, right? So that the cows can't get off the field. Well, the aphid, what happens is, this aphid, it eats far more of this honeydew nectar than it can actually digest. And so the ant goes up to it and rubs its abdomen, and it causes it to secrete this excess honeydew nectar. And then it takes it back to the nest. And it's the same way that humans milk cows, right? I know that's probably more information than you ever wanted to know about ants and farming, but anyway, they can do it. They can do a lot of other things too. They're also able to maintain gardens. They can conduct wars with generals and soldiers. They can keep one chamber of the colony at a specific temperature and a specific humidity, and another chamber at a completely different temperature and humidity. They can undergo massive public works projects. They can build huge turrets around the opening to their colony so that when the monsoons come, this is over in East Asia, India, when monsoons come, so that they won't flood the colony. And the list just goes on as to what these things can do. Now, researchers, they've always been puzzled by this, and they thought for a long time that the way they were able to do this was by the queen telling everyone what to do. But they found this actually isn't the case. They perform all of these functions without any oversight from the top. As long as there's a bunch of ants gathered together in one place, they're going to sense a need, and then they're going to work together to make sure that need gets accomplished. But as individuals, these ants can perform none of these functions. And so what's so fascinating about this, and the reason why I'm telling you, is because the ant colony, its success is dependent upon everyone and no one at the same time. Because here's what's happening. In order for the colony to survive, everybody has to participate. But because none of these ants understands why it's doing what it's doing, no one individual ant can sit there and say, well, yes, I'm responsible for this success. So it's a total bottom-up way of thinking. Nobody really understands how it works, but it just does. Nobody tells them what to do, but they know how to do it, and it all gets accomplished. Now, I think I can say with absolute assurance that humans do not operate this way. Our preferred method of organization is a leader who sits there and tells us what to do. Would you agree with that? Can you imagine if we got rid of all leaders in our society? Let's say we didn't want a president of the United States anymore. We say, we're just going to eliminate that position. We don't need that anymore. Can you imagine what would happen if we did that? What if we just said, hey, okay, here's the deal. We're all just going to get together and we're going to talk about it. Whatever issues might come up, we'll just work through it together because we're all reasonable people, right? And we can actually talk about things. So I'm sure no matter what it is, student loan debt, mortgage crisis, ISIS sweeping across the Middle East, I am sure we would be able to come to some kind of conclusion about how we would deal with these situations, right? Now, you all know that's not true. Why? Because we're a top-down kind of people. We need to have a leader, otherwise we tend to flounder, right? But what's interesting is, as much as we prefer a top-down model, here's the thing. If you read in the Bible, God does not. There's this great verse from Proverbs 6:6 that says, go to the ants, you lazy bones, consider its ways, and be wise. And it's weird that I actually guess I'm going to talk about the sermon for today, because I just want to tell you about ants. I don't know. I just thought it was kind of cool. Now, it actually does relate. You'll see a little bit later. So today, this is the last sermon in our Advent series, Jesus As. And we've been talking about how Jesus is like so many different characters from the Old Testament. If you've been here, you've heard me talk about that. So we've talked about how Jesus is like, do you remember the first one? Moses. Second, Jesus is like Joseph. Then we talked about how Jesus is like Jonah. And today we're talking about how Jesus is like David. You know what's funny? If you can barely remember the names of the people who we went over, I'm sure that sermon is just like gone. All those things that I did, it's just gone. That's the beauty of what I do, right? I get up here and I speak and everybody's like, well, we're out the door. And then it's just kind of gone out of the ears. And I'm like, well, that's 20 hours worth of work right there, down the tube. So today we're talking about Jesus like David. So who is David? David. Well, David was a king. He's one of the most important kings in Israel's history. Most historians believe he is one of the best kings. And to help you understand how he was the best king in Israel's history, I need to take you back a little bit and talk about how Israel came to be what it was. So who here has seen the Christian Bale movie, the new one, Exodus, Gods and Kings? Everybody, obviously, it seems. Hal, you saw it. Was it as horrible as they said it was? It was pretty horrible, right? Yeah. So it's good. Don't see it. It's supposedly horrible. So anyways, the point is, they come out of Egypt and they settle in the Holy Land, and they divide up this Holy Land. They carve it out into basically 12 basic areas, and that's based on the 12 tribes of Israel. Now, I told you, if you were here 2 sermons ago, I told you that the whole 12 tribes of Israel, basically it's based on this. There's this guy Jacob, or his other name is Israel. He has 12 sons, and those 12 sons become the fathers of the 12 tribes. So when they carve up all this land, you have to imagine that each tribe has leaders who are responsible for making sure that their land is defended properly. They've got to be responsible for their people, right? And pretty much from the moment they get there, they're getting attacked. So if you imagine you have all these different tribes, and they're having to defend their land, well, the smarter thing to do would be what? To join tribes together so you have more people to defend your land. Does that make sense? Okay, so that's what they start doing. But the more and bigger this army gets, they realize, well, you know what we need? We need a general. We need somebody who can oversee us. Now, who is the highest level of commander in the United States? You get all the way to the top. President of the United States, commander-in-chief. In Israel, that person is the king. And the first king of Israel was this guy named Saul. Now, I need to tell you how Saul became king because it relates to what we're talking about today. So, according to the Bible, this is what happens. There's this guy Samuel. Now, Samuel, he's a prophet. And all that word prophet means is he speaks on behalf of God. That's the idea. He speaks on behalf of God. In the Presbyterian church, you know I'm supposed to be a prophet. Did you know that? Because I speak on behalf of God. I'm sure you all believe that, right? So he's a prophet. And God goes to Samuel and he says, hey, guess what? I want this guy Saul to be my next king. So Samuel, he goes find Saul, and what does he do? He pours oil on his head and he says, guess what, Saul? You're the new king of Israel. All right, did you catch that? What just happened? Okay, that pattern becomes the pattern for all kings from that point forward. So let's do it again. We're going to go over it one more time. God tells a prophet that you are going to be king. So, the prophet goes out, he finds you, and he pours some oil on your head, and he says, guess what? You're the new king of Israel. Okay? That's the idea. Now, that second stage, the second part of it with the pouring of the oil, that concept is called anointing. Anointing. And the reason why they poured oil on your head was not just to make a mess, but so that they could make you holy, because they believed that when a prophet poured oil on your head, you were going to be a holy person. So these three steps, it actually caused people to refer to the king of Israel as the Messiah, or the Mashiach in Hebrew, because that word Mashiach literally means anointed one, and it refers to the second step of that process when you pour oil on somebody's head. Following me now? Okay, now if you were listening to the scripture that we read, we talked about when David becomes king. Now David, he's the second king in Israel. What happens is, apparently God gets upset with Saul and says, I don't want him anymore, we're going to find somebody else. So he sends Samuel to this guy Jesse's house, and Jesse, he has to line up all his sons, and Samuel goes through each one of them, and he's like, hey, none of these are the guy. Do you have any other sons? He's like, yeah, well, I got this one, but he's just this little kid out in a field. Are you sure he's the guy you want? He says, bring him in. He gets in front of him. God says, that's my guy. So what does he do? Pours oil on his head, and he says, guess what? You're the new king of Israel. Okay. This is actually really, really important because Christians believe that Jesus is the new David. They believe he is, or we're supposed to believe he's the Messiah, the anointed one, the new king of Israel. So, we've talked about Saul, we've talked about David, and now we got to talk about Jesus. But before we talk about Jesus, you know me, I like to talk about a little bit of history. I want to tell you about who the real Saul and the real David were. Not what we know from the Bible, but what we know from history. Okay, so I got to take you back. The way Saul became king was not that somebody dumped some oil on his head, okay? The way he became king was he was a general overseeing these various tribes. And when you have a bunch of guys who will do whatever you say, and they're an army, it's not too hard to declare yourself the leader, right? The king. It's pretty easy to do. Now, Saul was not a king in the most traditional sense of the word. He was not royalty. Saul was more like a military overlord. He came to power through force, and he was not exactly universally loved. So he's ruling for a couple of years, and then there's this commanding officer in his army, this guy named David, who performs a coup. He actually gets some troops who are loyal to him, and he takes over this area known as Judah. It's the tribal lands of Judah. Now, can you imagine how Saul felt about that? He was not particularly happy, was he, that David did this? And so Saul's always trying to kill David. Now, in the scriptures, what does it say about Saul? It says that David loved Saul. He respected him. That's not true. They hated each other. They were trying to kill each other because they both wanted power, right? Saul wanted to kill David. David wanted to kill Saul. Well, one day, Saul actually gets killed in battle. And all of his sons get killed as well, except for this one guy. The one son that's left is this guy Ishbosheth, and he's supposed to take over, but he never gets a chance to take over. You know why? Because he's assassinated by 2 of his army captains. Historians believe that David's the one who ordered the hit to basically take out Ishbosheth. Now what that means is Saul's family's gone. Who's left to take over? David. So he steps up into place, and he's considered to be Israel's greatest king. Now let me tell you why. So historically what we know is that David, he was a brutal, violent man. But he was a brilliant politician, and he was a good military tactician. You need to understand something. In the United States, we're an autonomous country, right? Nobody tells us what to do. This is not true of Israel. They were never autonomous. Even at their height with David, they were under the thumb of other nations. But what David did, which was so important, is that he actually had made covenants or agreements with these other nations to just let them be. And so in that way, things were going really well with him. And so he became this larger-than-life figure. He became this great leader for them. And they loved him as a result. Now, I asked this question in the last service, and I got a horrible response from it. But I'm going to ask it again. We'll see what happens. So, who do you all think the greatest president in our history is? If you were to ask people generally across the board who it is. I voted James Polk, but nobody seemed to go with that one. I think if we were to all take a survey, probably the person who we would all agree on across the board is George Washington. Okay? George Washington and probably Abraham Lincoln right up there, right? So George Washington is probably the greatest because he set the standard. Now, after George Washington died, there was a lot of mythologies that came out about him. You all probably know some of them, right? The cherry tree. Remember that one? How we cut down the cherry tree, and he's like, I cannot tell a lie, Dad. I cut down the cherry tree. Now, I grew up 15 minutes away from where George Washington grew up, and there's a lot more myths about him than just that one. But that's the one that most people know. Now, in the same way, David, when he grew up, there were a lot of myths after he died that circulated about him. One of those myths happens to be the David and Goliath story. Because if you look in the Bible, 2 Samuel, you actually can find the guy who is responsible for killing Goliath. They actually have it in there. But this story about David, it got inserted later on. And so you have both of them in there. It's actually there. You can look it up and find it. But that story about David doing that got in there later. Another mythology that got inserted is what we read today about how he becomes king. Because I just told you how he became king. But that mythology is very, very important. Even though it's a myth, it becomes very important for us because the gospel authors use that pattern to tell us that Jesus is a king. So, in Matthew, what we read was Jesus, he goes to this guy's house. His name's Simon the leper. And from nowhere, this woman walks in, and she dumps oil on his head. And then that's supposed to tell us that he's a king, right? Okay, what's interesting about this, and you got to follow me on this, because this is the really important point. Matthew has inverted the normal pattern. What's the normal pattern? The prophet, he comes down, he takes the oil, he dumps it on your head, he says, you're the new king. A prophet was one of the most respected people in Israel. But in Matthew, what happens is, he's in the house of a leper, and a woman who has no status in society walks in, pours oil on his head, and then, literally right after that, he gets arrested, and he's killed. So Jesus, he's being anointed not to become a king in the traditional sense. He's being anointed for his death. And this is supposed to tell us that Jesus is a very different kind of king than David. And this is what brings me back to the ant story. Well, it makes sense. Hold on. I'm going to make it make sense, okay? I'm going to make it make sense. All right. Regardless of what kind of guy David is, can we agree he's a top-down ruler? Okay, when he tells you to do something, He expects you to do it because otherwise there's going to be consequences. He rules from a place of fear. If you don't do what he says, then what's going to happen? Well, he's going to kill you, right? All right. Jesus, he's a very different kind of leader than that. Jesus is a bottom-up kind of leader. He rules not from a place of fear, but from a place of love. Because he doesn't impose his will on you, does he? Jesus, he gives you a choice. You can choose to follow him if you want to. You can choose to call him your king. And when you follow him out of a place of love, rather than out of a place of fear, it results in a very different kind of dynamic among his followers. Love is a much more powerful motivator than fear, though we often don't like to realize it or we can't realize it in our lives. I've given you this example before, but let me give you the example again. Have you ever thought about the relationship between a parent and a child? Think about this. If a parent rules the child from a place of fear, if the parent imposes their will on the child all the time, then the child comes to resent the parent, and the child will eventually revolt. This is true in dictatorships, right? When a dictator rules over a people and cracks down hard on the people, what happens? Eventually the people become upset and they will eventually revolt. However, if the parent rules the child from a place of love, then the child knows that the parent has the best interests of the child at heart and will more than likely do what the parent asks. And this is our relationship to Jesus. Have you ever wondered why so many of Jesus' early disciples were willing to die, literally be put to death for their beliefs in Jesus? If you want to know why, all you have to do is look at the kind of leader he was, the kind of king he was. If Jesus ruled from a place of fear, people will be far less willing to sacrifice for him. But he doesn't do that. Because he rules from a place of love, think about this, and this is the kicker right here. A king, a president, whoever he is or she is, they expect you to die for them first, right? But Jesus, he's the other way around. He says, you know what? I'm willing to die for you first. Now that changes things. Because when you know that, you are willing to sacrifice for him, regardless of what hardships might come your way. You are willing to do what it takes to make sure that the colony thrives. Does that make sense? So as I end today, I want to tell you, if you really do believe that Jesus is your king, then I have a feeling that the reason why you believe that is because you believe in Jesus' teachings of love, grace, and forgiveness, and you know that those are the most powerful force in this world. If Jesus is your king, then you have bought into the idea that it's more important to serve others than it is to serve yourself. If Jesus is your king, then when you are confronted with evil, injustice, and violence in this world, your first reaction is not like everyone else, where it's eye for eye, tooth for tooth. Your first reaction is what Jesus taught us, to love, forgive, and show grace and compassion to those around us. But most importantly, if Jesus is your king, you know he has given you a choice. May you choose to follow him as we come together and gather on Wednesday night to celebrate his birth and his presence among us. Amen.